Oh, hi there. So in this video, we're going to do some extra practice with different ways that government interventions in the market create different outcomes. So we'll look at price floors, price ceilings, tariffs, all kinds of good stuff. Let's get started. Okay, so this first problem is the whole page. And so it's going to be a little bit of a bear to kind of move back and forth a little bit. So I'm going to zoom this bad boy out just a shade. Oh, I'm already too far out. Okay, I'm going to come back up just a little bit here. And I know that makes the font just a little bit smaller. So if you have your own at home, that's probably a little bit easier on this one. It says that Italy makes shoes in a competitive market and the equilibrium is 50 a pair. Italy doesn't trade with anybody. And so part A says just label a shoe market and label the equilibrium quantity and price. So let's go ahead and start with part A. And we want to make our graphs really nice and big, right? That's a first kind of tip here is make it really, really big because it's going to be a lot harder if we don't. And let's say supply and demand. And I'm being a little bit careful here because I'm going to come back to this graph in more work. Equilibrium price is $50 a pair. And it doesn't tell us what that quantity is. It just says QF. So I'm going to go with that here, QF. And then part B. Now assume that Italy opens up its shoe market to the world and they start trading, and that's really cool. And then it gives us a world price of $30. Now, a world price, if you see a question that looks like that, it just means that there's kind of like a domestic supply curve. And that's what these are, domestic supply curve. But then there's kind of like a second supply curve, and it exists as an unlimited amount of shoes, so infinite amount of quantity at $30. So conceivably, this is like a flat supply curve. That's the supply from the world, and that's the world price, and we're going to say that that's $30. Now, on your graph in part A, show the world price of shoes labeled 30, the quantity supplied by Italian producers at that price, and the quantity of shoes bought at that price. So at $30, the domestic producers are not very competitive. They're only going to be able to produce this quantity, which we're going to label as QP. So the producers in Italy are going to have way fewer transactions, right? So we would say that world trade might be bad for the domestic producers because they aren't as competitive. But the buyers, the consumers, the demand curve intercepts $30 at QC, consumers. That's a way larger quantity than what it used to be. And that's because the price is lower. And so we now can say that more people can afford shoes in Italy, right? You know, it was 15, now it's 30. And then it says C, using the labels on our graph, identify the quantity of shoes imported. Well, the ones that are being produced domestically are QP, but we know that we're buying the amount QC. And so we're going to put a little bracket here, right there. And that quantity difference between QP is the import, right? And so we can also write off to the side, since it's a little bit asking for that, we would say it's QC minus QP. That's another way that we could say however much is the amount imported. D, did consumers of shoes in Italy benefit? Yes, they did. And the reason why, because it is asking for an explanation here, yes, because the price decreased from 50 to 30, right? And we had more consumption. Another way to say that, you could also say, and increased the quantity, is that the consumer surplus increased. We haven't talked about consumer surplus in this class yet, but that's really what they're going for, is saying that the total benefits of trade got bigger for the consumers. Now it says part E. Now assume that the government of Italy places a tariff on imported shoes. So they make the world shoes more expensive. They're going to leave the supply curve for the domestic shoes alone. That's tariffs only apply to the imports. So relative to the free trade outcomes in part B, which is like all this other stuff, is the price going to increase, decrease, or remain the same as a result of implementation? And so I'm going to draw what that picture would look like here, even though they don't tell us how much the tariff is. And it's going to increase that price. So however much, right, the supply plus the tariff now is, however much the tariff is going to shift that price up. So maybe it's like a $5 tariff, right? That's going to make the new world price 35. And so is the price now higher, relative to the free trade outcome? Well, yeah, it's a higher price because, we have a tax. So higher. And it's not asking for an explanation, but it's because, right, the world price now includes a tariff, a tax. And so we would say that the tariff makes the goods more expensive. Tariffs are gonna make the goods more expensive for the final consumers. It's also going to shrink the amount of consumption that's imported. So we're going to kind of go down to like this amount now, right, of imports. And you'll notice that like now the consumers are buying fewer as well because our new like QC would shrink. So tariffs are bad for consumers. But the people who benefit are these domestic producers who are now able to sell a few more units and be a little bit more competitive. Last part says F, why would a government prefer a tariff versus an import quota? And remember, quota is just, we would say, a quantity maximum. Well, why would the tariff be cool? Because the tariff generates money. So the tariff generates tax revenue, whereas typically quotas do not, right? Generates revenue to the government, while quotas don't. Quotas are just limits. And so there are quota licenses and that, but quotas limit, but they don't generate any kind of money. And by the way, we can actually even see in this graph how much that tariff income would be. If our tariff was 5, this little box right here is the number of imports. I'm going to shade it right here. This is the amount of imports now, right, that are happening after the tariff times the $5. And so let's say if after the tariff we imported 10 units, 10 times 5 is 50. That's how much revenue this tax is actually generating for the government. All right, let's take a look at these multiple choice questions. So this first question says, assume the government puts a binding price ceiling on an inferior good. And so there's a couple of things happening here. The first is obviously they're keeping the price low, but this next part is going to matter when it says consumers' incomes increase. If consumers' incomes increase and it's inferior, that's telling us that demand is actually going to decrease for this product. Now, I'm going to sketch off to the side because a lot of times it's helpful to have it, a little picture of supply and demand and a price ceiling. And the effective price ceiling would be below the equilibrium. And so we've got a quantity supplied that's less than the quantity demanded. And that's what we call a shortage. So when demand, this line, decreases, right? If demand were to decrease, then maybe if it decreases to here, well, there's even less quantity demanded, right? So now the shortage is even smaller. And so what we'd find is that the shortage in the market will decrease as a result of that lower demand. C. Number 2, following a prolonged power outage, the price of flashlights rises significantly. If cities had put a price cap, a price ceiling on those, what would likely happen? Well, it's not going to make more flashlights available. It will create a shortage of flashlights. And so not allowing the price to rise to re-equilibrate the market will lead to shortages, right? Where you have lots of people who don't have flashlights. It might also lead to the situation where some people are first in line and they buy up all the flashlights and then they sell them on the black market and they go, okay, for $100 a flashlight, you can have one. So oftentimes these kinds of price ceilings lead to counterintuitive and maybe counterproductive outcomes. Number 3, if the government eliminates an effective minimum wage in a competitive labor market, what's true? And so remembering that, a minimum wage is here, it's a price floor compared to, say, supply and demand. And that's going to create, because there's an excess of quantity supplied versus quantity demanded, it's going to create a surplus of labor. If we were to eliminate that, the wage would fall in this labor market. So for sure, the workers would have lower pay, but actually there would be more workers because you'd end up with a larger quantity demanded at this new lower wage. So there's going to be more people who get jobs, but they're going to get paid less. Let's see what corresponds. Workers will experience no change in hourly pay. That's not true. Workers will experience a decrease in hourly pay. That is true. These workers will experience a decrease. I could skip the rest. Number 4, an increase in which the following will most likely result in a long-run surplus of a product. So long-run here is an important word. It's saying that this is like a permanent surplus. What it's distinct from is like in the short run, sometimes if there's a whole lot of demand that it just spikes overnight, that can create a temporary shortage. Or if there's maybe a whole lot of surplus, right, or a whole lot of supply, that could create a temporary surplus. But this is saying like what would create almost a permanent surplus in a market, and that would be a price set by law above the equilibrium, because that price floor would lead to exactly what we had just right here, a permanent kind of long-run surplus. So we're going to go with B for number 4. Number 5, the table above shows quantity of gasoline supplied and demanded. If they put a price floor at $2.75, what's the outcome? Now, a lot of students would immediately say $2.75, but you're missing something important. In a normal supply and demand graph, right, when we have here supply and demand, the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal to each other at the same price. So in this table, look and see, well, at $2.50, no, they're not the same. $2.75, $3.25, they are the same. So these values are the same. And so that means the price in the market without the price floor is $3.25. If I put a price floor in down here and I say, hey guys, you can't go below $2.75. Well, they're already transacting at $3.25. So this is like a minimum. It is. That's what a price floor is. they aren't going below that minimum because they're already dealing at 325. And so that is actually what the market price is going to be. This is called an ineffective price floor. It's not binding. It doesn't do anything. Number 6, if the government imposes a tariff on imports of cheese, well, higher taxes are going to lead to obviously higher prices, and it's going to decrease that quantity, just like we saw in the graph a few minutes ago. So increase price and decrease quantity. Where do we see that? Increase price and decrease quantity. That's a D. Number 7, suppose the market for low-wage labor is perfectly competitive and in equilibrium. And so it's very much like this picture over here, but it says then the government establishes an effective minimum wage. So we're going from a scenario where we are here at like P star or W star, because it's a wage, and Q star, but now we're getting a price floor, right? A minimum. And so that's going to create a situation, again, where we have a difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied, where the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. And we call that a surplus. A surplus. Now, here it says employment of low-wage workers will decrease. That's true because there's less quantity demanded than there was at Q star. And unemployment will increase. That's also true because this surplus labor is literally unemployment. There was no unemployment in this market actually before that minimum wage showed up. And now there is because there's a surplus of workers who are willing and able to work, but they're not able to actually get hired. So we're going to go with A. Number 8, which the following is true of a price floor. And so we're going to test some options here. The intention of the government in creating a price floor is to help the producers of the good. That is why actually they exist. In the previous question where we had a price floor, the producers of the good are the low-wage workers themselves because they're actually supplying their labor, right? The supply of labor is actually kind of they're helped out by this price floor in that sense. Let's kind of go through the others for a second here. To have an impact in the market, the price floor should be set below. No, it needs to be above. C, an effective price floor will increase the quantity demanded of the good. Well, no, it's actually going to decrease the quantity demanded of the good because the price is going to be higher. D, the price floor would tend to create a shortage. No, it creates a surplus. And E, the creation of the price floor would not change the quantity supplied of the good if the supply curve were upward sloping to the right. That's just not true either. It obviously creates more quantity supplied because you're moving up the price level as you move from here to here. So we're going to go with A. The intention is to help the producers, which is what we thought all along. Number 9, the very last question. The graph shows the market supply and demand curves for a particular product. If they impose a price ceiling, the important maximum price at P2, so in other words, this is our maximum. You can't go above that, guys. What's going to be true? Well, right off the bat, that maximum is set above what the P star equilibrium is. So this is not going to do anything. It's just the same as this other question where you haven't actually designed the intervention correctly. And so our correct answer here, B, the quantity sold in the market remains at Q2 because the price ceiling isn't binding. It would work if they had put the price ceiling down here, but they didn't do that. They set the price ceiling too high, so it doesn't do anything. I hope this helps you with multiple choice with government interventions. I'll see you next time.